The Zoltharian Empire had been expanding across the galaxy for over 300 years, and their method of conquest was simple and brutally effective. They would arrive at the edge of a star system with their massive warships gleaming in the darkness of space, and then broadcast a message that had been heard by countless civilizations before. The message was always the same, and it always worked. Surrender your world within 3 days or watch it burn from orbit. Most species chose to live rather than fight, and the Zoltharians had perfected the art of taking worlds without firing a single shot. Commander Vexthor stood on the bridge of his flagship called the Eternal Dawn and watched as his fleet moved into position around a small human colony world. The planet was called New Portland, and it housed roughly 2 million humans who had settled there only 15 years ago. The world had amber skies and 3 small moons, and from orbit it looked peaceful and defenseless. Vexthor had done this same operation 47 times in his career, and he expected this one to go exactly like all the others. The humans would receive the ultimatum and they would panic, and then they would surrender. It was the way of things in the galaxy. The strong took what they wanted and the weak gave it to them. His second officer approached him with the transmission ready to broadcast, and Vexthor gave a simple nod. The message went out across all frequencies in every language that humans used, and it was clear and direct. The people of New Portland had 72 hours to evacuate the surface and relocate to designated holding areas where they would be processed and assigned to work colonies throughout the Empire. Failure to comply would result in orbital bombardment that would destroy every city and settlement on the planet. There would be no negotiation and no extensions. This was the only warning they would receive. On the surface of New Portland in the Colonial Capitol building, Governor Lisa Morgan received the transmission while sitting at her desk reviewing infrastructure reports. She was a woman in her early 50s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too many budget meetings and supply shortages. She had been the governor of New Portland since the colony was founded, and she had guided these people through harsh winters and crop failures and equipment breakdowns. She was not about to let some alien empire take her world. Without a fight, she called her military advisor, Colonel Jake Murphy, into her office immediately, and they both watched the Zoltharian message, again on the large screen. Jake was a tough man in his 40s who had served in Earth's defense forces before retiring to the colony, and he knew exactly what they were facing. 16 warships in high orbit, and each one powerful enough to crack continents. New Portland had 20 atmospheric fighters that were designed for patrol duty, and some ground-based railguns meant for shooting down asteroids. Against a real military fleet, they had essentially nothing. Lisa looked at Jake and asked him the question she already knew the answer to. "Can we fight them?" Jake shook his head slowly and told her the truth. "Not with what we have here. We would last maybe 10 minutes if we engaged them directly. Our only hope is Earth." Lisa nodded and told him to send the emergency transmission immediately. "Use every comm relay we have and make sure it gets through. Tell Earth we need the fleet and tell them we need it now." Jake hurried out to coordinate the message, and Lisa sat alone in her office staring out the window at the amber sky. She could see people walking in the streets below going about their daily lives with no idea that alien warships were overhead, preparing to destroy everything. She would have to tell them soon. Evacuation protocols would need to be activated, and the underground shelters would have to be opened. But first she needed to do something that might be incredibly stupid or incredibly brave. She needed to respond to the Zoltharians. She composed a short message and had it transmitted directly to the flagship. The message was simple. "The people of New Portland reject your ultimatum. This world belongs to humanity and we will not surrender it. You have 72 hours to leave our system. After that, we will consider your presence an act of war." She sent the message knowing full well that it might trigger an immediate attack, but she also knew that humanity did not negotiate with invaders. That was the one lesson that had been burned into human culture after centuries of conflict. You never give ground to bullies because they will just keep taking more. Commander Vexthor received the response and at first thought it was some kind of translation error. No species had ever rejected his ultimatum. Not once in his entire career. He replayed the message 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly, and then he felt something close to anger rising in his chest. These humans were threatening him. They were threatening the Zoltharian Empire with their handful of primitive fighters and their outdated ground weapons. It was insulting beyond measure. He opened a direct channel to the planet's surface and demanded to speak with whoever was in charge. Lisa's face appeared on his screen moments later, and she looked calm and composed. Vexthor studied her with his alien eyes, trying to understand what would make such a clearly outmatched opponent choose defiance. He spoke slowly, making sure his words were translated properly. You refuse. No species has ever refused. Reconsider immediately, or I will reduce your capital city to ash and glass. Your people will die screaming, and it will be your fault for this foolish pride. Lisa did not flinch, and her voice remained steady when she replied. Commander, we have already sent word to Earth. Our fleet is coming. If you remain in this system, you will not survive the encounter. I strongly suggest you take your ships and leave while you still can. This is the only warning you will receive from us. Vexthor stared at her in disbelief. She was bluffing, obviously. Earth was weeks away, even at the fastest travel speeds, and his intelligence reports indicated that humanity's military was spread thin across dozens of colonies. They could not possibly mount a meaningful response in 72 hours. He terminated the connection without another word and turned to his tactical officer. Prepare orbital bombardment protocols. When the deadline expires, we will destroy their primary population centers. Make it devastating enough that other human colonies will hear about it and think twice before defying us. The officer acknowledged the order and began running targeting solutions while Vexthor returned to his command chair. He felt certain that this was just another bluff from another desperate species. In 72 hours, the humans would realize their mistake and beg for mercy. But by then, it would be too late. The 72 hours began counting down like a clock ticking toward doomsday, and on New Portland, the evacuation sirens started wailing across every city and settlement. Governor Lisa Morgan activated the emergency protocols that had been drilled into every colonist since the day they arrived. People grabbed their emergency packs and headed toward the underground shelters that had been built deep beneath the surface. The shelters were designed to protect against meteor strikes and radiation storms, but they would have to serve as protection against orbital bombardment now. Each shelter could hold thousands of people and had enough supplies to last for months if necessary. Parents carried children through the streets while elderly residents were helped along by neighbors and volunteers. Nobody panicked because everyone had practiced this drill dozens of times. They moved with purpose and efficiency, knowing that their lives depended on reaching safety before the deadline expired. Lisa remained in the command center, which had been relocated, 50 meters underground beneath the Capitol building. The command center had walls lined with screens showing feeds from cameras across the colony, and tactical displays showing the positions of the Zaltharian ships in orbit. Colonel Jake Murphy stood beside her, reviewing what little defensive capability they possessed. 20 atmospheric fighters were fueled and ready, but they were designed for air superiority and reconnaissance, not space combat. The ground-based railguns could fire into orbit, but their targeting systems were meant for slow-moving asteroids, not military vessels with shields and electronic countermeasures. Jake ran simulation after simulation, and every single one ended the same way. Total destruction of New Portland's defenses within minutes, followed by unrestricted bombardment of the surface. Lisa asked him if there was any chance at all, and Jake was honest with her. If they fire on us, we cannot stop them. Our only hope is that Earth responds before the deadline expires. But he did not say what they both knew. Earth was too far away. Even if the fleet had left the moment they received the emergency transmission, it would take weeks to arrive. The laws of physics could not be negotiated with or threatened. Faster-than-light travel had limits in distance, was still distant no matter how advanced the technology became. Above them in the cold darkness of space, Commander Vexthor watched the countdown timer and observed the humans scrambling into their holes like insects fleeing from light. His tactical officer provided regular updates on the evacuation progress and noted that the humans were being remarkably organized about it. There was no chaos or rioting, just efficient movement toward shelter. Vexthor found this mildly interesting but ultimately irrelevant. Organized or not, they would all die when the bombardment began unless they surrendered. He had given them every opportunity to avoid this fate, but they had chosen pride over survival. That was their mistake to make. His sensor officer had been monitoring the edge of the star system, watching for any sign of human reinforcements, but there had been nothing. No ships, no transmissions, no evidence of any response whatsoever. Vexthor allowed himself to feel satisfied that his assessment had been correct. The humans had been bluffing. They had no fleet to send, or if they did have one, it was too far away to matter. In approximately 48 hours, the bombardment would begin, and New Portland would become an example to every other human colony in the sector. Defiance would be met with annihilation. The hours continued to pass, and the tension on New Portland grew thicker with each minute. Most of the population was now safely underground, and the surface cities stood empty and silent under the amber sky. Lisa sat in the command center drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago and reviewing reports from the shelter coordinators. Everyone was accounted for. Everyone was as safe as they could possibly be given the circumstances. She had done everything she could to protect her people, but it did not feel like enough. She kept checking the long-range sensors, hoping to see some sign that Earth had heard their call and was sending help, but the sensors showed nothing except empty space and distant stars. Jake tried to reassure her by reminding her that Earth's fleet might be running silent to avoid detection, but even he did not sound convinced by his own words. Lisa appreciated the attempt, but she was a realist. She had bought her people 72 hours, and they had used that time to take shelter. If the bombardment came, they would survive the initial strikes, and then they would dig out and rebuild. Humans were good at rebuilding. It was practically their specialty, but she had hoped it would not come to that. She had hoped that her message to the Zaltharians would carry enough weight to make them hesitate. She had hoped that Earth would find a way to respond. Hope was a dangerous thing when you were facing impossible odds. Then, with only 12 hours remaining before the deadline expired, something happened that changed everything. The sensor officer in the command center suddenly called out that he was detecting a massive quantum distortion at the edge of the star system. Lisa and Jake rushed to his station and stared at the display showing ripples in spacetime that could only mean one thing. Ships were dropping out of faster-than-light travel. Big ships, or lots of ships, or both. The distortion signature was enormous, far larger than anything that should have been possible. Given the distance and the time frame, Commander Vexthor saw the same distortion on his sensors and felt a cold sensation spreading through his body that he did not immediately recognize as fear. His tactical officer started calling out readings that made no sense. Quantum distortion confirmed. Multiple signatures. Counting now. 10 contacts, 20 contacts, 50 contacts. The numbers kept climbing and climbing, and the sensor display turned red with warning indicators as the computer struggled to process what it was detecting. 100 contacts, 200, 500. The officer's voice began to shake as he continued counting. 1,000 contacts, 2,000, 5,000. Vexthor stared at the display, unable to believe what he was seeing. The quantum distortion bloomed across his view screen like a flower made of twisted space and reality, and from that distortion emerged ships, human ships. Thousands upon thousands of human ships dropping into normal space with perfect precision and forming up into combat formations that stretched across millions of kilometers. Battleships and carriers and destroyers, and cruisers and support vessels all bristling with weapons and painted with the insignia of Earth's United Defense Force. The fleet filled the sensor display like a swarm, and at its center was a single massive vessel that dwarfed everything around it. The tactical officer finally stopped counting and reported the final number with a voice that had gone hollow with shock. 12,416 vessels confirmed. All weapons hot. All shields active. They are combat ready. Vexthor felt his legs weaken beneath him, and he gripped his command chair to steady himself. This was impossible. Absolutely impossible. No fleet this size could have assembled and traveled this distance in 72 hours. It violated everything he knew about logistics and military deployment. But there they were on his sensors, as real as the stars themselves. The humans had not sent a defense force or a rescue mission. They had sent an armada that could crack entire civilizations. The Bridge of the Eternal Dawn had gone completely silent as every officer and crew member stared at the sensor displays, showing the impossible human fleet that had just materialized at the edge of the system. Commander Vexthor tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but his mind kept rejecting the data as some kind of sensor malfunction or elaborate deception. No civilization moved fleets of this size. No military force could coordinate 12,000 ships with such precision, yet there they were arranged in perfect attack formations, with weapon systems active and shields, radiating enough energy to light up every sensor. On his ship, like warning beacons in the darkness, the communications officer broke the silence with a trembling voice. "Sir, we are receiving a transmission from the human fleet. It is directed specifically to you on a command channel." Vexthor wanted to refuse the call and order his fleet to jump away immediately. But he knew that running without even listening would mark him as a coward for the rest of his life. He straightened himself and tried to project an authority he no longer felt. "Put it on screen," he commanded, and the view screen flickered to life, showing the bridge of a human warship. A woman appeared before him, wearing a dark blue uniform decorated with medals and insignia. That meant nothing to Vexthor, but clearly indicated high rank. She had gray eyes that seemed to look straight through him, and her expression was calm and professional, like someone discussing a routine matter rather than a potential war. Behind her, the bridge of her ship hummed with quiet activity, as dozens of human officers worked at their stations with practiced efficiency. The woman spoke first, and her voice was steady and clear, with no hint of anger or aggression. "I'm Admiral Christine Walker of the United Nations Space Navy. You are currently in violation of the Frontier Protection Act and have threatened a human colony world with military action. You have one opportunity to withdraw peacefully." Vexthor felt a surge of indignation that briefly overcame his fear. How dare this human speak to him as if he were the one at a disadvantage? He commanded 16 warships of the Zaltharian Empire. He had conquered worlds and crushed fleets and made entire species kneel before his empire's might. "You dare threaten the Zaltharian Empire," he responded with as much authority as he could gather. "We have conquered civilizations older than yours. We have crushed fleets 10 times the size of what you possess. You think your numbers frighten us? We have fought against worse odds and prevailed every time." Admiral Walker's expression did not change, and she did not interrupt him. She simply waited until he finished speaking, and then replied in that same calm, professional tone that somehow made everything worse. "Commander, let me explain something about human military doctrine. When someone threatens our people, we do not send negotiators. We do not send diplomats. We send the fleet. The entire fleet. Every ship that can fly and every weapon we can bring to bear." She gestured to something off-screen, and the display changed to show an external view of the human armada. Thousands of ships in perfect, geometric formation stretching across the void, with their hulls reflecting starlight, and their weapons glowing with barely contained power. "This is what we call a proportional response," Christine continued. "You threatened 2 million civilians, so we brought enough firepower to end your entire empire, not because we want to, but because we need you to understand something fundamental about humanity. We do not bluff. We do not posture. When we say we will defend our people, we mean it absolutely." Vexthor tried to find words to respond, but his tactical officer was frantically running combat simulations, and the results were appearing on side displays where he could see them. Every simulation ended the same way: total destruction of the Zaltharian fleet within seconds. His 16 warships that had seemed so powerful now looked like toys compared to the armada facing them. "You would go to war over one colony world?" he asked, because he genuinely did not understand the logic. One world with only 2 million inhabitants was not worth risking a major conflict. Any rational empire would negotiate and find a compromise. But Admiral Walker shook her head slightly, as if he had missed the point entirely. "We would go to war over one human life," she replied simply. "That is the part you did not understand when you made your threats. Every person on New Portland has family and friends and loved ones back on Earth and 100 other worlds. You were not threatening a colony commander. You were threatening someone's daughter or someone's father or someone's child, and humanity does not negotiate when family is threatened." She leaned forward slightly, and Vexthor saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It was not anger or hatred, but something far more dangerous. It was absolute certainty. The certainty of someone who had already decided on a course of action and would not be deterred from it by any argument or threat. "So here is what is going to happen," she said, and her voice dropped lower but remained perfectly clear. "You are going to order your fleet to jump out of this system within the next 10 minutes. You are going to return to your empire and tell them that human space is off limits permanently. And if any Zaltharian ship ever crosses into our territory again, we will not send a warning. We will just send the fleet." Vexthor looked at his tactical displays again and saw that the humans had achieved weapon locks on every single one of his ships simultaneously. 12,000 targeting solutions calculated and active. His weapons officer reported that even if they fired first with everything they had, they would be lucky to destroy a dozen human ships before being annihilated. The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. This was not a battle he could win or even survive. This was an execution waiting to happen, and if we refuse, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Christine's smile was thin and contained no warmth whatsoever. Then in about 3 minutes your flagship will cease to exist, followed by the rest of your fleet approximately 8 seconds later. We have already run the combat simulations, Commander. Would you like to see them? She was offering to show him exactly how his death would occur as if it were a PowerPoint presentation. The casual nature of the offer was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. Vexthor felt something break inside him. All his confidence and all his pride and all his certainty about the Zaltharian Empire's place in the galaxy crumbled under the weight of those 12,000 ships and the cold professional manner of the human admiral who commanded them. His second officer leaned close and whispered urgently, "Sir, our shields could not withstand even a fraction of their first volley. We would be destroyed before we could return effective fire. We must withdraw." Vexthor knew this. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to run while he still could. But he needed to salvage something from this disaster, even if it was only his dignity. "Commander," Vexthor stood on his bridge surrounded by displays showing him a truth he did not want to accept, but could no longer deny. His empire's reputation for military superiority had been built on intimidating species who were unprepared and isolated. But humanity was neither of those things. They had been watching and preparing and building a military machine that could crush the Zaltharian Empire like an insect under a boot. He looked at Admiral Walker's face on the view screen and saw no mercy there. No willingness to negotiate or compromise, just patient expectation that he would make the only logical choice available to him. "How did you arrive so quickly?" he asked, because he needed to understand how his intelligence had failed so completely. The humans should not have been able to respond this fast. The distances were too great and the logistics too complicated. Yet here they stood with an armada that must have taken months to assemble and position. Admiral Walker seemed to consider whether to answer, and then decided that the truth would serve her purposes better than mystery. "We did not," she said simply. "This fleet has been assembled and ready for 3 months, Commander. When you entered our frontier space 6 weeks ago and began your survey operations, we knew what was coming." She pulled up a tactical display that showed timestamps and fleet movements going back weeks before the Zaltharians had even issued their ultimatum. "We have studied your tactics against the Bren Collective and the Morphean Alliance and the Keltar Federation. You broadcast threats and you wait, and you assume your victims will choose survival over resistance. We positioned this armada 1 light-year away from New Portland. When Governor Morgan sent her message, we jumped immediately. Your mistake was assuming we would wait to be threatened before taking action." The words hit Vexthor like physical blows. They had been prepared for him specifically. They had watched his empire's expansion and analyzed every conquest, and built a response force designed to counter his exact strategy. He felt like a predator who had stalked what he thought was prey, only to discover he had been walking into a trap the entire time. "You were waiting for us," he said, and heard the defeat in his own voice. "Waiting specifically for us, we are prepared for everyone," Commander Christine replied. "Humanity learned a long time ago that hope is not a strategy. When we expanded into the galaxy, we did not do it naively. We built defense networks and early warning systems and rapid response fleets. This armada represents about 15% of our total military capacity." The number felt impossible. 15%. This overwhelming force that could destroy his entire fleet in seconds was just a fraction of humanity's military power. How large was their full strength? How many ships could they field if they committed everything? The implications were staggering. Captain Dan Richards, who served as the tactical officer on Admiral Walker's ship, spoke up from his station. "Admiral, the Zaltharian vessels are beginning power-down sequences on their weapon systems." Christine nodded slightly and returned her attention to Vexthor. "Commander, I am detecting weapons deactivation. Is that your way of accepting our terms?" Vexthor straightened his posture, trying to maintain some dignity, even as his world collapsed around him. "The Zaltharian Empire withdraws its claim on this system. We will depart immediately." "Not just this system," Christine corrected firmly. "All human systems. Every colony and every outpost and every ship flying our flag. You will establish a buffer zone of 50 light-years and respect it absolutely. Any Zaltharian vessel that crosses that boundary will be destroyed without warning. Are we clear?" The terms were harsh and humiliating, but Vexthor had no leverage to negotiate. His fleet was completely at the mercy of the human armada. One wrong move and they would all die here. Clear, he said quietly. Good, Christine replied. You have 10 minutes to begin your jump preparations. Use them wisely. The communication channel closed and Vexthor stood in silence for a long moment. Around him his bridge crew waited for orders. They had never retreated before, never been forced to back down. The shame of it would follow them forever. Begin jump calculations, he ordered, and his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. We are leaving. His officers moved to comply, and within minutes the Zaltharian fleet began powering up there, faster than light drives. Down on New Portland, deep in the command bunker, Governor Lisa Morgan watched the tactical display, showing the Zaltharian ships preparing to depart. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. They came, she whispered. They actually came. Colonel Jake Murphy put a hand on her shoulder and his own eyes were wet. That is what Christine Walker does, ma'am. She does not lose. Around them, the command center staff began cheering and hugging each other as the reality sank in. They had survived. Their world was safe. The fleet had arrived in time. Lisa immediately opened a channel to all the shelters across the colony. This is Governor Morgan. The threat is past. The Zaltharian fleet is withdrawing and our people are safe. Earth sent the fleet and they came when we needed them most. You can begin returning to the surface. We are going home. The cheering from the command center was echoed in shelters across the planet, as 2 million people learned they would not die today. Families embraced and strangers celebrated together. The colony of New Portland had faced annihilation and survived because humanity had proven that it would defend its own no matter the cost. In orbit above the planet, the human Armada maintained perfect formation with weapons, still locked on the retreating Zaltharian vessels. Admiral Christine Walker stood on her bridge watching the enemy ships vanish one by one into faster-than-light transit. Only when the last Zaltharian vessel had disappeared did she allow herself to relax slightly. Stand down from combat alert, she ordered. Bring us into standard orbit around New Portland. Let us make sure the colony is secure. Her crew responded with professional efficiency and the massive fleet began repositioning itself into a protective formation around the planet. Christine looked at the amber world below and thought about the 2 million people who lived there, people with families and dreams and lives they had built from nothing on a frontier world, people who had been hours away from death until the fleet arrived. She had done her job. She had protected human lives. That was what mattered. Captain Richards approached her with a status report. All ships reporting ready status, Admiral. No damage sustained and all systems nominal. The Zaltharians did not fire a single shot. Good, Christine said. That means our message was received clearly. Richards hesitated and then asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Admiral, did we really need to bring the entire sector fleet for this operation? 16 Zaltharian ships could have been handled by 1/10 of our forces. Christine turned to look at him and her expression was serious. We were not just sending a message to the Zaltharians, Captain. We were sending a message to every aggressive species within 100 light years. They were all watching to see how humanity would respond to a direct threat. Now they know. Now they understand what happens when you threaten human lives. She gestured to the tactical display showing the positions of other alien civilizations throughout the region. Some of them had been considering expansion into human space. Some had been testing boundaries and probing defenses. All of them had been watching New Portland to see if humanity would back down or stand firm. For years we have been the newcomers, Christine continued, the species that arrived late to the galactic community. Every empire out there was wondering if we were strong enough to hold our territory, or if we would be easy prey. Today we answered that question. Today we showed them that humanity does not negotiate when our people are threatened. We send overwhelming force and we win decisively. Richards nodded, understanding the strategy now. So this was never about just saving New Portland. It was about establishing deterrence across the entire frontier. Exactly, Christine confirmed. The cost of deploying this fleet was enormous, but the cost of fighting a dozen smaller conflicts over the next decade would have been far greater. Now those conflicts will never happen because every potential aggressor knows what they will face if they cross us. 3 days after the Zaltharian withdrawal, Admiral, Christine Walker stood in Governor Lisa Morgan's office on the surface of New Portland and looked out at the amber sky that 2 million people had feared they would never see again. The office had been damaged during the evacuation when equipment was hastily moved and furniture was shoved aside, but the colony's people had worked around the clock to restore it. Through the windows, she could see children playing in parks and construction crews repairing the last damage from the frantic rush to the shelters. Life had returned to normal with remarkable speed because humans were resilient and adaptable and refused to let fear paralyze them for long. Lisa offered Christine a cup of coffee, made from beans grown in the colony's greenhouses, and the Admiral accepted it gratefully. "Thank you," Lisa said simply. "I knew Earth would respond, but I never imagined anything like what you brought." Christine took a sip of the coffee and smiled slightly at the local flavor. "Governor, you did everything right. You bought us time and you protected your people and you stood your ground. That matters more than you know." Lisa shook her head, uncertain how her actions had made much difference. But why send such an overwhelming force? Surely a smaller fleet would have been sufficient to make the Zeltharians leave. The Admiral sat down, her cup, and pulled up a holographic display showing star charts, with red markers indicating dozens of other aggressive civilizations scattered across the region, because we needed to send a message that would be heard across the entire galaxy. The Zeltharians were not the only ones watching. She pointed to various markers representing species that had been expanding their territories or testing human borders. For years, humanity has been seen as newcomers and potentially weak and possibly naive. Every expansionist empire in this sector was watching to see how we would respond to a direct threat. If we had negotiated, or if we had given even an inch, we would have faced 100 more challenges just like this one. But now they know what happens when you threaten human lives. Back on Earth in the United Nations Strategic Command Headquarters, Fleet Admiral Henry Scott reviewed the incident reports with his senior staff. The New Portland response had deployed nearly 16% of their strategic reserve and required 3 months of careful positioning. It had cost enormous amounts of resources and coordination, but as Henry closed the final report, he felt completely satisfied with the outcome. "Worth every credit," he said. "How are the other frontier colonies responding?" Commander Kate Price, who served as his intelligence chief, brought up a series of data streams showing communications from human settlements across known space. "Settlement requests are up 40%, Admiral. Colonists feel safer knowing we will respond like this. But sir, there is something else you need to see." She displayed a collection of intercepted communications and diplomatic requests. "We are receiving formal contact requests from 17 species who previously ignored our diplomatic overtures. They want to discuss mutual defense treaties and trade agreements and non-aggression pacts." Henry leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a rare smile. "They saw what we did to the Zeltharians." Kate nodded. "More than that, sir, they saw that we were willing to commit everything to protect a single colony world. That kind of dedication is rare in galactic politics. Most empires would sacrifice outlying colonies to preserve their core worlds. We did not even hesitate. That makes us either crazy or extremely dangerous, and nobody wants to fight either one. Because we are not an empire," Henry said quietly. "We are a family spread across the stars, and you do not abandon family." Kate made notes on her datapad and then mentioned one more development. "Sir, the Zeltharian government has requested formal negotiations. They want to establish permanent borders and sign a non-aggression treaty." Henry considered this briefly. "Send them our terms. 50 light-year buffer zone, as Admiral Walker specified. No Zeltharian vessels cross that line for any reason. If they agree, we will consider the matter closed. If they refuse, we will consider it an ongoing threat." Kate acknowledged the order and left to coordinate the diplomatic response. 6 months later, the Zeltharian Empire formally signed the Treaty of Boundary, recognition at a ceremony attended by representatives from dozens of species. Commander Vexthor was present not as a disgraced officer, but as an advisor to the Zeltharian diplomatic corps. He had been relieved of his military command, but not as punishment. His superiors recognized that he had made the only logical choice when faced with impossible odds, and his recommendation for the treaty had been based on cold, strategic analysis. He had seen the future of Zeltharian expansion, and that future ended in fire if they continued to provoke humanity. Better to accept defined borders and peaceful coexistence than to face annihilation. On New Portland, life had not just returned to normal, but had surged forward with new energy. Governor Lisa Morgan stood at a dedication ceremony for New Portland Defense Park, where a monument had been erected to commemorate the day humanity's fleet had arrived to save them. The monument was simple in design but powerful in meaning. A tall pillar of black stone rose from a circular plaza, and inscribed on its surface were the names of every ship that had been part of the Armada. 12,416 names etched in neat rows that wrapped around the pillar in a spiral. At the top, a single line of text read simply, "They came when called." Lisa spoke at the ceremony with her voice carried across speakers to thousands of colonists who had gathered. "We stand here today because humanity keeps its promises. When we called for help, the fleet came. Every ship that could fly and every crew that could fight came to defend us. Not because New Portland is wealthy or strategically important, but because we are human, and that is enough." She gestured to the monument behind her. "Let this stand as a reminder to our children and their children. Let them know that no matter how far we spread across the stars, we are never alone. Humanity protects its own." Admiral Christine Walker had sent a message to be read at the ceremony, and Lisa played the recording for the assembled crowd. To all who would threaten human lives, Christine's voice rang out clear and firm. "We will not negotiate. We will not compromise. We will not abandon our people. We will send the fleet. Every time. Without fail. This is not a warning. This is a promise." The crowd erupted in cheers, and the sound echoed across the colony like thunder. People embraced and children waved flags, and for a moment the entire world celebrated the simple fact that they were alive and free. The message from New Portland was transmitted across human space and beyond. It was picked up by alien listening posts and analyzed by foreign intelligence services. Some species interpreted it as aggressive posturing, while others saw it as a statement of principle. But everyone understood the fundamental truth it represented. Humanity had claimed its place among the stars not through conquest or intimidation, but through an unbreakable commitment to protect their own. In military academies across human space, the incident at New Portland became required study for every officer candidate. Not because of brilliant tactics or innovative strategies, but because of the philosophy behind the response. Overwhelming force applied with absolute certainty. Immediate deployment without hesitation. Complete commitment to protecting human lives regardless of cost. Young officers learned that the greatest weapon was not the ships or the firepower, but the certainty that humanity would use them without question. That certainty had turned potential enemies into cautious neighbors. That commitment had made humanity's frontier space the safest in the sector. Governor Lisa Morgan looked up at the monument and thought about the future. New Portland would grow larger. Other colonies would be founded. Humanity would continue spreading among the stars, but they would do it knowing that they were not alone. Knowing that if threatened, the fleet would come. Knowing that humanity kept its promises, and somewhere in the depths of space fleets remained ready and crews remained trained, and admirals like Christine Walker remained vigilant. The promise would always be kept. They would send the fleet, always.